Well, thank you so much for having me and for all the support in organizing this event here. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take us on a bit of a journey into understanding the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom, because it is quite a complicated beast to understand. Partly because it is, in fact, the oldest political party in the world. The modern Conservative Party, as it is today, was only founded in 1834. However, its history goes back further to the 1670s, to the origins of the Tory party, which was a party initially set up as a pro-monarchist voice for the landed gentry and for the representation of rural voters in opposition to the Whigs, which was the precursor of the Liberal Party. And one of the reasons why the Conservative Party today is still in its position and still able to hold the mantle of being the oldest political party is because of its adaptability. The fact is that the Conservative Party that was set up in 1834 would be almost unrecognizable when compared to today's one. It's gone on a journey, and I think that the strength of our party is in that over time we've been able to adjust to new voters and to adapt to the changes whilst maintaining a conservative position. And what's at the core of that is the fact that the Conservative Party, contrary to its name, isn't really one party, but rather a coalition of interests. Inside of the Conservative Party you find a number of factions, but I will focus on the three main ones. The first being the traditionalists. Those are the ones that are perhaps closest to where the Conservative Party started, as they are a more rural base, they are more established, they're old money, they're based on the principles of the High Anglican Church. The second faction is one that emerged in the Victorian age, which is the One Nation Conservatives. And this comes from the more liberal conservative tradition of Benjamin Disraeli. It focuses instead on a more urban base and later evolved into a more suburban base. It promotes social justice, it promotes a fair trade rather than free trade. And then the final of the three major factions are the economic liberals. And this is perhaps the youngest of the three main factions within the party. Most notably, it rose to prominence in the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher. But of course, it comes from an older liberal tradition, which goes back to the end of the Second World War and the end of the First World War as well, when the Liberal Party declined with the rise of the Labour Party, with many disenfranchised former Liberal voters switching over to supporting the Conservatives and trying to find a new home for free trade and limited government. And the way these factions operate is that although in many areas they contradict each other, they often find that there's a sense of common ground. And through that, they're able to build coalitions, usually around a particular leader. So if you were to look at our recent leaders, starting with Thatcher, you would find that her base was built around the economic liberal faction, which she helped to boost to prominence, but also the more traditional faction within the party. David Cameron, who was Prime Minister from 2010 to 2016, his base was more built around a coalition of the economic liberals and the One Nation Conservatives. And then when you come forward to today with Boris Johnson, you would find that he is a coalition of the traditionalists and the One Nation Conservatives built around a more working class base. Because one of the things that's happened with the Conservative Party in recent years is that our voting demographic has shifted drastically. At the 2010 general election, when David Cameron was first elected, it was easy to tell how someone voted based on their economic circumstances, which is to say that working class voters in the United Kingdom voted for Labour, whereas those who were in the professional classes, in the services industry and so on, were more likely to vote Conservative. However, in 2019 and gradually over time, this has shifted. So the 2019 election was the first election in which your economic class wasn't the deciding factor. Almost universally across all economic strata, you could see the same percentages voting for the Conservative Party. And it marked a shift from economic background to age being the defining factor. I think one of the more alarming facts in the last election was that whilst those aged 65 and over, 60% of them voted for the Conservative Party, those aged between 18 and 35, only 19% voted for the Conservatives. And it shows a much wider gap on demographics there. Yet contrary to that, the Conservative Party has gone from strength to strength in the last decade. In 2010, we were in a coalition government, having only just managed to win the election, so we ended up with the Liberal Democrats, and we only secured 36% of the vote. Yet in 2019, the party secured 44% and governed with an absolute majority. We had 365 seats. And this is, of course, because we had to coalesce our internal coalitions again. One of the problems we had around Brexit was that the party became divided, and when the party is fighting amongst itself, the public loses interest in supporting us. So I think that one of the messages, perhaps, that other countries could borrow from the strength of the Conservative Party is that when the centre-right recognizes that the common enemy isn't they shouldn't be fighting each other, but that the common enemy is on the left, you find that you get a much stronger result. And I think perhaps sort of latching on to what was said about the CDU, part of the problem they had was, of course, that they were in coalition with the left, which made it very difficult for them to differentiate themselves and to distance themselves from left-wing policies that they opposed. I think I'll finish by saying a couple of things about where else the strength is in the party, which is, first of all, the strength of our coalitions and being able to have a common sense of purpose. But secondly, it's about ensuring that that common sense of purpose reaches the widest possible margin. Unlike many other centre-right parties in Europe, immigration for us isn't a top priority. Instead, our focus is on the economy, on making sure that things work in infrastructure, making sure that we have growth and high employment. And ultimately, it's a policy position that transcends any other divide in the country. The reason the UK has had some relative success when it comes to migration is because our emphasis has been on integration and on the supportive creation of business. And that has helped to encourage many ethnic minorities within the UK to vote for us. You just need to look at the Conservative benches in the House of Commons and you'll find people from all sorts of backgrounds. Our current Interior Minister, Priti Patel, is herself a refugee. Our Chancellor of the Exchequer, so the Finance Minister, is a Hindu. And our Deputy Prime Minister is of Central Eastern European origin. And it's shown the sort of power that Conservative policies have in unifying not just ourselves and on centre-right, but unifying the public. I think I'd much rather hand over to questions now, if that's not a problem, because then we can have a bit more of a discussion about the Conservative Party. If not, I'm happy to talk about Brexit as well.
Thank you for an interesting lecture. I was thinking about, you mentioned this shift that economic class is no longer a strong predictor of how you vote. How much of that do you think is because the Tories have been able to, like you said, you adjust your policies, for example, the NHS, strengthening that, and so how much do you think is a successful adjustment from your party, and how much do you think is just the general development, because you can see similar trends in other European countries as well.
There's a bit of both at work here, which is, I think, one of the things that the Conservative Party recognized in both the 2017 general election and 2019 was that a lot of the working class voters were finding that the Labour Party no longer adequately represented them. It had become too much of a metropolitan-focused political party. It no longer represented working rights. It no longer represented the view of these people. And of course, Brexit was a very big deciding factor in that, because overwhelmingly, Labour areas voted for Brexit, whereas the official position of the Labour Party was to remain in the European Union. So you found this situation where they were increasingly disenfranchised. Now, of course, a lot of these voters didn't go directly to the Conservative Party from Labour, because a lot of them had grown up with this view of the Conservative Party as being, we used to call it the nasty party. It was horrible. It was all about Thatcher closing the mines. It was all about the negative impact of liberal economics and so on. And so a lot of them would have been ardently anti-conservative before those elections. Well, what ultimately happened is that they shifted. So we found that in the same areas where the Conservative Party started winning seats in 2019 and 2017, in the years before, the difference had been UKIP, and that UKIP would win about 14% there. But without them, those voters who had historically been Labour, then to UKIP, then finally moved to the Conservative Party.
Hello again. Actually, I'm sort of going to ask the same question as to Norman about regional things, but instead of Saxony, about Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think there is a possibility that the Conservative Party is going to make a comeback in Scotland? And what are the outlooks for Northern Ireland?
That's a very interesting question, because, of course, one of the major changes to have taken place in the United Kingdom in the last 30 years is the introduction of what we call devolution, which is that before, Britain was a centralized state in which all decisions were made at Westminster. But in the 1990s, the Blair government introduced regional parliaments. So, for example, you have a Senate in Wales, you have the Scottish Parliament, and you have the Northern Irish Assembly. And early on, Conservatives were critics of that. And as a result, we didn't take it seriously. I don't think we ever performed as well as we should have. What's happened in recent years is that we've had something of a resurgence. So today, we sit as the largest opposition parties in both Scotland and Wales. With the collapse of the Labour Party in Scotland in favour of the SNP, we've found that we are the strongest unionist voice and the most credible unionist voice. Do I think that we'll ever be in a position where we're able to knock the SNP out? I think it would take a lot of work. I don't think that it's going to happen anytime in the next decade. But as long as we continue to stand and prove that we are the party of the union, we should do quite well. Now, Northern Ireland is a slightly more complicated arrangement, because none of the traditional parties in the mainland Britain stand in Northern Ireland. So what you have is a series of alternative parties. You have, and they're split on different loyalties. So rather than being about left or right, they're on the basis of whether they are loyalist, as in or unionist, so in favour of remaining part of the United Kingdom, or whether they're nationalist parties, which is to say that they're in favour of joining Ireland. Now, the nationalists are fairly unified. There's only two parties that cover that, and that's Sinn Féin, who don't take seats in Westminster because they're abstentionists, because they don't recognise the government in London. And they're also a major political power in the Republic of Ireland. Then you have the I forget, SDLP, Social Democrat and Labour Party, which is a sort of sister party to the British Labour Party, but is also a nationalist party. So it's seen as an acceptable face to Irish nationalism. However, on the right and on the unionist side, you find that the market is totally oversaturated, because you have the Democratic Unionist Party, which I'm sure some of you might be familiar with, because we had an agreement with them after the 2017 election. You then have the Ulster Unionist Party, who are the oldest of the pro-union parties, and then you have another one called the Traditional Unionist Voices. Now, there is a Northern Irish Conservative Party, and a very close friend of mine's just been elected the chair of it. And he's said that he's willing to express the view that they need to start taking Northern Ireland more seriously, and that because of the factional fighting between the existing unionist parties, that perhaps the Conservative Party has a chance to come in and say, look, we're non-sectarian. We're not Catholic, we're not Protestant, we're not Irish, but we're British. We're going to come in as a viable alternative. So I think it would be interesting to see how the Conservative Party grows there. But the expectation is that they won't win any seats in the Assembly, but that they might win seats in the local authorities.
My question is about the identity of Britain. And what I mean by that is I have just quickly searched for John Cleese, and he actually cancelled. It's even better, but I like shouting. But John Cleese, he actually had a famous quote which said that London is no longer British. And my question for you would be, where do you think Britain or the UK could find its identity in the future? Are the migrational processes irreversible at this point? Or, yeah, basically, how can UK get back to its roots? How can it find its identity?
I think in order to understand that, you need to understand what it means to be British, which is that British identity isn't based on being born there. It's something that you can adapt to and adopt. I think Daniel Hannan puts it best when he defines Britishness as being a meme rather than a gene, which is to say that by subscribing to a certain set of values, you become British. Now, what is that? That's a respect for the Westminster parliamentary system and the rule of law. It's an understanding of our deep history. It's a recognition that origin has very little to do with destination. So, for example, we always talk in the UK of how when people come to the United Kingdom, they can effectively choose to become British. So the change that we're seeing is that whilst the diversity of the country is expanding, the view of being British hasn't changed at all. It's much the same. It's much easier to integrate. Britain is, after all, a nation that was built on wave after wave of immigration. You can go right back and say, oh, it's the Celts, then the Romans, then the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans, and then after that you had waves of immigration from the Netherlands, from Sweden, from all sorts of places. And by the way, the arguments over immigration have always been the same. If you go back to the Great Fire of London, when it came to blaming those who were responsible for it, it was the Dutch immigrants who blamed the Swedish immigrants because they were the latest incomers. And they were trying to say, well, these people, they're causing trouble here, they're criminals, they're bringing all of their problems with them. And, it's exactly the same arguments that people try to make today. And by the way, one of the interesting points about Brexit that I always find is that it transcended so many lines. I remember I was going between campaign stops. I used to take taxis and carry these big boxes of campaign material with me, and I got into one taxi, and the driver was a sort of elderly Kashmiri man, and he asked me, "Oh, so you with which side of the campaign are you in?" I was a bit reluctant to say, "Oh, well, I'm on the Leave side," and he said, "Good." I said, well, "Okay, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, I'm voting Leave, my whole family is voting Leave, everyone at my mosque is voting Leave, so can you give me some leaflets that I can leave in the mosque and that I can hand out to people and give to my customers," and so on. And it came from this sense. In Britain, when people migrate there, everyone's on an equal footing. It doesn't matter where you've come from. Now, his problem with the European Union was that he believed that as a non-European, he was being treated as a second-class citizen. And there were a lot of people who came from the Commonwealth who voted Leave for that exact reason. They felt, well, why is it that Romanians, Bulgarians, Hungarians, whoever can come to Britain and take a job before me. I've lived here for longer. My children are born here. And they, you know, this also extended to our position in the European Parliament. When Britain left the European Union, we took with us half of all minority ethnic MEPs. That one member state represented half of all of the diversity within the European Parliament. And that sort of, I think, explains this sense of Britishness being more about values than about origin.
Thank you so much, Robert.
Yep.